Hello and welcome to Calmversations with the Voice of Reason. I am your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Heather Heying, who is the author, along with her husband, Brett Weinstein, 1T Weinstein, of A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, which talks about our origins as a species and how the modern world is not necessarily attuned with our past, and trying to bring those two into a particular equilibrium that will provide for more future of our species than they are is apparent when we look at the instability within our various systems. Right now, in this conversation, I speak with Heather Heying, who I met shortly after the Evergreen State College fiasco in the spring of 2017, and we were friends because our trajectory into the public eye was initiated by the same exact event. So she's a friend and kind of a colleague, but she's still a professor. I'm just a lowly, whatever I am. And so without further ado, here is Heather Heying. I remember hints that you were dilly-dallying in the humanities.
Indeed.
That was your first love intellectually?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to be a writer. I was a literature major.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Romantic fiction, erotica.
That's right. Actually science fiction. So at the point I was on sabbatical at Evergreen, I had come full circle and was trying my hand at what I'd wanted to do all along.
Mm-hmm. Your book, The Hunter-Gatherer's Guide for the 21st Century, it kind of ends on like a speculative fiction note, where you guys move from describing our past and describing our present into beginning to sketch out some sort of future for everyone. And what's the difference between what you guys are doing in there and what you would do in fiction?
What's the difference between the kind of speculation in the book and the kind of speculation that I have engaged in when I have written science fiction, none of which is published, none of which is available?
Yet.
The speculation in the book is explicitly about how it is that we can get out of our current circumstances on Earth with regard to society and civilization. And so, and also doesn't propose any kind of blueprint, right? Says we need to get off of the hill we're on. It's crumbling around, underneath us and out from under us. So we need to find another adaptive foothill from whence hopefully we can climb into some fourth frontier, some higher peak, right? But it doesn't actually presume to tell the reader how that will go, because that, we argue, would be a kind of arrogance that no human actually has access to that knowledge. Whereas what I've written about in the yet unpublished science fiction novel that I was in fact working on when Evergreen blew up is farther afield by a lot. I began by asking the question, what would conscious life look like if it evolved wholly separately elsewhere in the galaxy? And what if humans basically got over, I explicitly fast forward in that book beyond our current predicament and say, 150 years-ish, we've either figured it out, we've got a stable equilibrium, sustainable on the planet, and now we can actually reach for the stars, or we haven't, and we're gone. So I fast forward, I say, okay, we did it. I'm not going to specify how. I'm not going to spend time there. That's not this book. And now we've got a program where we actually are trying to figure out what star systems might potentially have life on them, and beyond that, intelligent life, and what kinds of ways does that look? And so I follow some Earth expeditions, will be, if it becomes a series, into various star systems to figure out what different evolutions of life would look like, depending on everything from the physics of the planet and the chemistry of the planet to more specifics about the biology, and then the culture as well.
Yeah. The interesting thing about human beings, and you guys hit on this, is that we are niche makers of niche makers. In a way, all of our different cultures are kind of different worlds, kind of different experiments with, different parameters. Is that salient?
Yeah.
And what do what's like the main thing that stays the same between cultures, and the main thing that like adjusts the differences, and from all the studying and thinking about that you've done?
That's an interesting question. There are a ton of human universals. And we list some of them in the book and not all of them. And it's not just things like language and tool use and the fact that there are two sexes, but those are also. There are things like making music and having hierarchy within both sexes, different, and the ways that manifests are wildly different. But there's hierarchy, and there's music, and there's sociality over food, and there's intergenerational overlap that manifests in multiple ways, but very often I think universal is the teaching of younger generations by older generations, usually by more than one of the older generations. There's storytelling, there is cooking of food. Also. So, it goes across all of these domains. So, what does that leave to be different? Well, so many things. So every culture known has some kind of fashion, but what that fashion looks like and how it manifests and what kind of meaning it is imbued with is wildly different. And of course that changes super fast too. So to some degree, it's hard to know what to make of fashion changes in other cultures, whereas in our own weird ones, we can say things like, as hemlines get shorter, that means something about the economy, right? Oh. Does that hold true across in other cultures? Do the women come to dress more or less provocatively with predictable changes in economics? I don't know. I've never run into that in the anthropological literature. Interesting possible question. My guess would be it's at least variable in how it manifests across cultures.
The weird thing about the modern culture, and I guess it's the Western modern culture, and which is within it has this kind of postmodern deconstruction thing that's happening to try to keep us humble, even though that kind of goes a little bit overboard because it's like an acid that doesn't stay in its jar. But when we think globally, we kind of assume that our values are everybody else's values, or we presume that. We end up presuming that. And in a couple passages in your book, there's one part where you basically get assaulted by these males in this foreign land. And in the book, you guys call it regressive, but that's your weird, WEIR, Western, educated,
industrialized, rich, democratic. Yep.
Yeah. So there's a value set that you're bringing to that story. How do we self-evaluate? Like when you say something's regressive, that's kind of, you're presuming that something that should be universal. Like there's this universal tendency that we have in our language. And it seems like we have to have some of that to a certain degree, but too much of that flattens the cultures and flattens the world.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, we start the book by saying, no naturalistic fallacy here. We're not going to conflate what we understand to be true about human evolution and how we got where we are with what ought to be. And of course, we all do that a little bit, right?
Yeah.
We have to. And it's exactly in the sort of realm that you are pointing out, where things maybe begin to get a little, where each of us set that bar is going to be different. And so I would hope that anyone with whom I was interested in having a conversation would grant that genocide is regressive, right?
Okay. Regressive towards what then? Like what's the, like, how are we defining regressive?
So you use the term regressive. I guess you said that we used that.
Yeah, it was in the book. It was just
the story. Yeah. Regressive with regard to what we should, and here I will use the word should, aspire to be. Okay. What are the things that evolution has handed us that we can do better than, that we can escape from the orbit of, and we are arguing we should aspire to escape from that orbit. So things like genocide and rape and murder in general, right? And even murder, though, there are moments when self-defense is justified. So murder is actually not necessarily on that list, but I think I will just say right here, right now, genocide and rape. Yep, we should be able, and we should all be able to agree that this is something that humans should aspire to get beyond.
Okay.
Will we ever? Don't know, but we should aspire to get beyond it. And so the story in the book about, I was young. It was Brett and I were together in Nicaragua and Managua, and a group of young men surrounded me and started to sort of shuffle me off. And it wasn't terrifying as it maybe should have been. It didn't have the valence of, being obviously an abduction that would lead to some sort of, mass rape, but it certainly could have been that. Mm-hmm. And the fact that I cried for help and Brett showed up, and then what they did was they apologized to him, not me, as if I was property.
Yeah.
That's a place where I'm going to say, you know what? We all should aspire to not treating women like property. Okay. Right? Not imagining that I was safe only because I was there with my boyfriend at the time, and maybe a different result would have happened if I hadn't been, and maybe that was okay. Like, no, actually, I'm very comfortable, and that is outside of the realm of strictly evolutionary thinking. I'm very comfortable saying, mm-hmm. I want a world in which we all agree that we aspire to that kind of behavior disappearing from the human repertoire.
Yeah. So specifically with regards to women being treated as property, that's a kind of, I get in trouble with this word because I fight with this word so much, a patriarchal kind of lens on distributing resources. And there is sound evolutionary thinking about why men would perceive women that way because of maternity and paternity and all these other things. What are the mm-hmm. conditions that allow us to not view each other as property?
There's a long, multi-hundred million year history of sex roles that end up with females being more likely to be treated as resources than males are treated as resources by females, with the exception of a few sort of intriguing sex role reverse species like seahorses and chicanas. Mm-hmm. So what can we do to escape that, to maximally escape that? Well, some of the ways of being that humans have invented do a better job of escaping the idea of women as chattel, women as resources than others. And frankly, one of those ways is having a mating system that equalizes the number of adults who tend to be in partnerships, so that you don't, polygyny, usually just shorthanded to polygamy in humans, mm-hmm. where you have single males being able to monopolize the reproductive attentions of multiple females, multiple wives, single males, inherently, just because of sex ratios tending to be 1-to-1 across all species, always, with some rare exceptions. You'll tend to have bachelor pods if it's lions, or baboons, or we call them different things in humans, but bachelor groups of males who are sexually wanting and aggrieved and more likely to do violence, not just unto each other and unto other men, but certainly unto women, and that will be more likely to manifest as rape. So the more even effectively the sex ratio within relationships is, the more likely that men and women can view each other as partners, as equals, and there will be less likely to have roving bands of young men like the one that I was unfortunate enough to encounter in Nicaragua, to say, that thing looks available. Like, wait a minute, guess what? Not a thing, and not yours, and
mm-hmm.
Not your choice.
Mm-hmm. It's illustrated in your book. You guys bring up, I think it's the baboon, but I think one of the sentences, and please correct me if I'm misstating it, is that in these different mating systems within animals that do have one male capitalizing multiple females, the males tend to evolve traits that have to do with beating the crap out of each other, right? So I think on a social level, that's what you probably will tend to see, is that you'll have males adorn themselves with more abusive behavior, both for interspecies or intersexual competition and intrasexual competition, correct?
Yeah, exactly. No, you got that exactly right. That the weaponry sometimes takes on physical qualities like bigger canines, right? Or just more brawn, bigger size, more sexual size and strength dimorphism, where males are a lot bigger than females. But you also expect it to happen behaviorally. So, signals of strength and ferocity will become greater and greater in such cultures and in such species. And yeah, they can be used against other males in male-male competition, and they can also be used against females as a form of coercion. And we should want, I'll use the word again, we should want to minimize that if we are going to live in a society in which half the population isn't at risk of actually being taken advantage of simply by being overpowered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what you were saying is that there's a system, like a meta system, that would predict that or make that come to be, such as monogamy would be one way in which it would relieve sexual, flatten the sexual landscape with regards to need and supply and demand, and then also introduce the concept of longevity to. It would also place the sexual act within a longer time frame, such as a lifetime.
Right. So, so it's a rejection of the arguments that we make are a rejection of the modern thing that is called sex positivity, and an embrace of what I would love to be the thing that's being called sex positivity. Just like I want to reclaim the word feminism, I want to reclaim sex positivity. Sex is amazing. Of course it is. And feminism should be this, totally obvious conclusion / ideology that, women should have all of the same advantages and opportunities that men have. And, both of these things, sex positivity and feminism, have been changed into some weird parallel universe version of themselves that don't look like they're good for either men or women, frankly. So engaging with each other over a lifetime does allow for many more opportunities for sexual pleasure, actually, in addition to everything else than one night stands. And certainly, there's pleasure to be had in one night stands, but it's inherently more finite. And as our culture, just looking at our culture, as we move more and more towards an embrace of that, as if all things being available at all moments is going to maximally make us happy and joyous and full of pleasure. What do we actually see? What do people actually report about their level of sexual pleasure and relationship satisfaction now? It's going down. And I don't think that's a coincidence.
You, when in the part of the book where you talk about food, you guys suggest shopping at the edges of the grocery store where most of the fresh foods are, the fresh meats, poultries, and then the vegetables and stuff. Maybe shopping at the edges of the sexual marketplace is where you're going to find the freshest meat.
That's it's Sammy. You could reframe that as you're searching for kink or something, but that's not what you meant. That's not how I'm going to take it. And just to be clear, the shopping the edges is Michael Pollan's point. We attribute that to him in the book, but shopping the edges of the supermarket is Michael Pollan's point. He does not make the point about the sexual marketplace or kink or anything like that, as far as I know.
Yeah. But still, it's kind of the same basic metaphor. I don't want to stretch it too far. There's the stuff that's produced for you, that's shelf stable in a way that can constantly give you the same hit. And then there's the stuff that's kind of variant because it has a life of its own, more or less. I mean, vegetables are pretty standard, but Right. But
it's certainly this metaphor that you're invoking, or this analogy, maybe it's both, works if you just compare real life interactions to those that have been packaged for later use. So basically, actual interaction with another sexual partner versus porn, right? And we don't explicitly make the distinction in the book between porn and erotica, although we do elsewhere.
You mention it.
We do. Okay, we do a little bit. But porn specifically, sex produced for later consumption by a marketplace that does not have anyone's best interests at heart, that is specifically about the bottom line, the financial bottom line, is is, yes, exactly akin to shopping the interior of the supermarket for shelf-stable foods.
Yeah.
Will it get you off? Okay, sure, probably. Will that can of shelf-stable foods sustain you to allow you to live another day? Probably. At what cost? At what cost to your longevity, your either physical, your dietary longevity or your sexual longevity, to play out the analogy a little farther.
The odd thing is that the ideas that brought us abundance, certain ideas brought us abundance, and then that abundance took those ideas and then turned them into something different almost. Like, let's just say Enlightenment liberalism, the scientific method, and the products of that, such as antibiotics, and massive amounts of shelf-stable food, then turn liberalism into kind of like this bloated illiberalism. There's this weird kind of switch. How do we get back there? Like, what was the switch in your mind where things started becoming off the rails a little bit? Was it just we were too gifted and times of plenty just end up doing this? This is just kind of the law of nature that when there is an abundance, decadence occurs in any population.
Boy, there's like 8 questions in there, Benjamin, as you tend to do. One of the answers to one of those questions, I think, and it's something we propose at the end of the book, is something akin to what we think the Maya did. So the Maya built in times of plenty, we argue, pyramids. They engage in these massive public works projects. And instead, basically, of turning the surplus harvest into more Maya, into more people who would then starve during bust years, when they experienced boom years, they engaged in public works and they made life more interesting and more productive in one sense, but not more productive in the population sense for all, such that in lean years, they actually could still feed their populations, we argue. But they also, what they didn't do was continue to build the pyramids at the same rate that they had been. So, investing in art, in beauty, in things that all of us take pleasure from and can lean into and observe and interact with, and maybe create more ourselves, learn from, engage with some public works project, and then go on to write a poem or discover something or explore, whatever it is that all of our individual passions and skills are. These works that are public, that all of us can share, can be inspirational, whereas simply turning surplus into more of the same will, of course, lead to failures down the road, because we don't, growth doesn't look like that. Growth, you zoom in at the fractal level, and it's a lot of ups and downs. And so if the only thing that you do when you're in a growth phase is make more of same, there will be a lot of devastation and destruction during every single one of those downturns.
Yeah, and so not only a lot of waste in the present, but also a dilution of the pleasure in these things as well. Yeah,
and the pleasure and I'm searching for another word. Productivity is not quite the right word because it means both things here. Productivity can mean economic growth, but I'm looking for the word that is like the individual analog of productivity, wherein either discovering what your particular skills and passions are, or already knowing what they are, you become the best you that you can possibly be. You create, discover, explore, heal, communicate, whatever it is, in a way that is maximally good for both your community and for yourself. Presuming that you're not one of those very rare people whose skills run to the nasty and, unethical.
The outside of the supermarket, but the dark side. You brought up discovery, and this is something that it just kept on popping into my mind over the course of the book, was the hero's quest. And at the end, you guys start talking about kind of being someone who is an innovator, somebody who's self-possessed. I don't even know if this is a possible question to answer, but why would we be a species where that individual life arc is so important, and enshrined in so many of our myths and legends? Like, what is it about us that's something that is important, and why is that so important for each of us?
That's a super interesting question. I wonder. I'm going to take it back a long ways into deep history first and say, being social is itself fairly new. There's a lot of sociality in a number of vertebrates, and even in famously in the hymenopterans, in the ants, bees, and wasps, who have evolved a kind of eusociality, which is largely due to their very strange genetics. But we do have examples of organisms coming together and in some ways losing their individuality when they do, especially among the eusocial ants, bees, and wasps. But any social organism, especially if they are also long-lived, with generational overlap and long childhoods, as we have, as elephants have, as parrots have, as wolves have, as the other great apes have, as dolphins have. And that's not an exhaustive list, but it's a pretty good list.
Okay.
Those organisms that are not just social, but have all of these other things, are dependent on one another in a way that our asocial counterparts aren't. Right? All mammals are social at some point in their life because, being mammals, we have obligate maternal care in the form of gestation and lactation. But for many mammals, that period of tight mother-child bond ends at weaning or sometime after weaning, and the children, depending, may go off and never see their mother again, and they may live fairly solitary lives. So, wolverines, for instance, they may come together for some period of time during courtship, but they don't even, they don't pair bond, and they don't hang out in groups. The only time really as adults that they are hanging out with other wolverines is either when they're in a courtship phase, or for females, when they actually have babies. So males really are much less social, in fact, than females have a chance to be. So you become social, and now you lose a little bit of your individuality, and yet we are still individuals. We do have borders between the individual, and although most of these biological borders with categories that are real are a little fuzzy, the individual border between you and me is pretty real, right? Like we're here exchanging ideas, and as we do that, I'm bringing on board some of your thinking, and that's now going to incorporate into my ethos. And I think the same thing will be happening in the inverse direction. But if I ask for where the physical border of myself is compared to you, it's pretty clear. Temporally, we can argue about when you start being an individual and when you end being an individual. Questions of when life begins and when life ends. These borders are fuzzy, and we can actually have legitimate disagreements about them. But the individual, except at the edges, is pretty coherent. And then we start to lose some of that a little bit as we get social. And then humans, exactly as you were alluding to before, we argue that the human niche is itself niche switching. We are able to cross all of these boundaries, find all of these ecosystems, and create new habitats for ourselves to be in. That itself is going to require that we are both generalist and specialist. And so we kind of exist as this generalist species. And this, again, is an argument we make in the book. We are this generalist species full of specialists. So some of us, I'd say you are in this category. I think of myself in this category. Actually, what we do in part is we cross domains, that we are ourselves. We may have depth in particular domains as specialists, but we also are the generalists who can dip into other domains and say, what's going on there? I have enough sort of 30,000 foot knowledge to look in and say, I'm not a specialist here. I don't know exactly, but I have enough insight and experience of the world to look in and say, what are the questions that I might ask that might help me and others listening to me get expertise in this? So I'm not sure I exactly remember what question I was answering, but I think there's something there about pulling back towards individualism in terms of specialization as the species that is by far the most dominant and successful on the planet, humans, wherein we're kind of going back and forth between the individual and the collective.
You You two make a definition of love that I haven't heard before, but it's salient to within the evolutionary framework that's presented in the book of, I can't remember how you stated, but it's the ability to empathetically incorporate the other into the self or extend your boundaries. If you look at just the arc of human development and development of consciousness, there's this, you begin as this completely needy thing. You begin as the center of the universe. You're not really aware. You just kind of want, and your mother gives. If you're lucky, and lucky you, and then you go through a stage of cultural acquisition where you basically, I think you could even, I don't know, but I would think that the first words that people grasp are things that they have power over in a way, where they're able to manipulate things in a way verbally. And as we grow, and if you are lucky enough to get a good education that kind of gives you the tools to, be responsible, be aware, and then also be actionable in the world, there is this period, this magic period, whether it's like 15, 14, 24, whatever, in that weird period where there's this quest, there's this really strong drive to find your niche, what you love to do, what you want to discover. And that seems to be where love is put in the back burner, unless it's romantic love, which is more possessive kind of love, like I want you kind of thing. But like the love that extends the self and that's really connected to the other people and even to the community kind of diminishes during that phase of investigation and discovery that the hero goes on, or heroine goes on.
That's super interesting. I think you're right. I'd never thought about that exactly in that way, but yes. So despite what some sort of modern social constructionists, social scientists will tell you, childhood is universal and adolescence is too. It manifests very differently in different cultures. But I don't know what I'm about to say, to be certain, but I think that quest for meaning that comes on, as you say, maybe sometime in the like 15 to 25, which is, is pretty big spread there. But for all of us, at some moment, I think many people I've asked, actually, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe I'm about to, is there, can you remember a moment in your own development when you realized, I'm actually now really looking for meaning? Is there a moment, or even a year, or a set of ways that you were acting where you were doing that?
Yeah, there was the first break, but it compounded until my mid-20s, where I kind of stopped searching so much and started building. Started like, wait, I'm searching. I'm not creating though. So I have to actually like dedicate myself and kind of get married to a craft. But yeah, it was the same. It was the same moment. Poetry and sexuality like kind of emerged, and then I'm like, just meaning just started flowing through me, Yeah. And then, but meaning was kind of ricocheted off of my feelings for women, but then it kind of went through these different phases. But that was kind of like the moment where I just kind of got really fiery.
That's great. And I mean, I think that's a great way of describing it. And I think so many poets in particular would describe something somewhat similar, right? Although I think your description was perfect. I think my experience was different. And I suspect that part of that is just that on average, men and women have a different experience of coming of age, right? And of what that looks like at the sexual level. And, basically as, a young man coming of age begins to lust and begins to want lots of what he sees and doesn't necessarily have access. And a young woman coming of age maybe begins to lust as well, but is suddenly everyone is on offer. Like, everyone is coming at a young woman who is anywhere close to the beauty standards for her culture. And it's very much not a like, I want, but rather, oh, I'm going to have to actively, I got to keep this at bay here. I got to stop this somehow. Yeah. And so the searching for meaning, I think my guess is, and certainly it was for me, for women in general, might be more likely to be separate from the sexual coming of age. And so I was looking for meaning. I had been, I'd been a classical pianist for my whole life. That's what I was supposed to be, and it became clear that was not what my passion was. I was very skilled because I'd been practicing 2 hours a day for many years, but it wasn't the thing that I wanted to do. And I also loved math, but I didn't think that's what I wanted to do. And so I became a wordsmith. That's where I was really interested, as you were talking about, in creating, but it was fiction, it was short stories. And then separately, I went looking for the bigger sorts of what is this? What is this meaning? I dabbled in a couple of sort of not new age, but new agey ways of thinking about humanity and the world. And then I also landed with Buddhism for a little while and was lucky enough to spend time on an extended retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, and a number of. I was a 17-year-old, and I was with a bunch of beat poets and this renowned Buddhist monk, and somehow I got to participate there. But honestly, that quest for meaning then persisted through college. I was still looking. I was still, I took this class called Religious Approaches to Death. I never had religion myself, but I was interested in figuring out what the various ways of understanding us were. Okay. And then Brett, actually, we had been friends forever, and we had just started dating, and he gave me a Dawkins book, and he said, maybe some of the meaning you're looking for is in this book. And so that was part of the quest for meaning as well. That was many years long, but that's when I landed on evolutionary biology.
Okay. And your story, just to encapsulate it begins like just the way you talked about it, you begin like wordsmith, and then you're like it's stories, and then beliefs, and then beat poets and Buddhistic retreats, and it's ravenous time there. And then you're going. It seems like you're looking for bigger and bigger encapsulations or frames.
Yeah.
And or bigger and bigger whys. You guys describe evolutionary thinking as there's the how of things work, and then there's the why of things work. So with regards to what you describe as your quest for meaning, you were searching for a way to ask or answer why.
I think your question is the answer to the question. I was searching for an understanding of what we are, what humans are. Why me and my family and my friends at that point, in late 1980s Los Angeles, why that life? What sense could I make of it such that I could live a life that would leave an honorable and valuable trace? And to what end any of it? I was not an animal behaviorist yet. I wasn't a scientist yet. I had scientific instincts and scientists in my family, but I didn't think that I was going about this thinking scientifically, but I was watching other animals and tending to plants and going, okay, but what about them too? What is the meaning to be had in any of this? And I think most teenagers end up asking some kind of question like that, and maybe again, teenagers 15 to 25 years old, that kind of bracket, we're looking for meaning that is about what's it all for? Like, what are we doing here? And then the follow-up question is, okay, given whatever I landed on as an answer to that, how can I make my life the best and most valuable one that's possible?
Mm-hmm. In a lot of people's quests, the world's always offering us different frameworks, and human beings especially, like here, I have that which will give you meaning, and like we saw at Evergreen, like we see within certain domains of the gender industrial complex, there are these habitats where a lot of youth are being brought in, and altered on many different levels. There are certain people who are, for whatever reason, maybe they're exhausted, maybe they're running from trauma, or all these different reasons why they do get stuck or locked into a worldview that's not necessarily expansive or has downsides to it that they aren't necessarily aware of until later on down the road. And then there's other people who kind of sense maybe because of their upbringing or any given lucky, spread of traits that like, no, that's not right. No, that's not quite right. That's not quite right. Or like with the, why did you not stick with the new age stuff? Like, what was it in you that was like, grew out of that or questioned it or didn't say, this is me forever?
Yeah, that's a great question. It didn't fit. It didn't explain enough. And I think, ultimately a scientific approach to the world seeks to, and I think we say this maybe even in the introduction of the book, explain the most while assuming the least in a way that fits with all the other explanations that are out there.
Okay.
And so, basically makes the fewest assumptions and is maximally explanatory. And then if you have a few of these, can you fit them together? And if you've got a few of these that are mutually exclusive, well, you got to choose one. If you accept, we all have assumptions. If you accept that there is a reality, an objective reality out there, whether or not you actually think that we can ever understand what that reality is, or that, even I as a scientist will grant that we may never know when we've gotten there. Right. It is my interest and my goal to understand the most about what the objective reality that we're living in is. But that doesn't mean that the scientific method will inherently inform us when we've arrived there. But an assumption that is non-negotiable for me, and always was, is the belief in an objective reality, that there is something real out there. And I do think without that, it's much easier to be I was going to say unhinged, and that's not the right word. I mean, untethered. Untethered. Yeah. And then I think, that can lead to a kind of unhingedness, because there's, we want as few tethers as possible, as few assumptions as possible, but granting that there is an objective reality, that if I walk off a cliff, it's not going to be a Wile E. Coyote situation. It's going to, oh, wow.
I love that. That was great. Okay, use that as the thumbnail.
It's not going to be a situation where I have to be aware of gravity before gravity hits, right? It's actually, gravity exists whether or not I know about it. It just does. It just does. So, I think Buddhism was very appealing to me as a sort of a framework for understanding how to be in the world and how to be really my best self with people. But it didn't explain very much to me. So for me, the new agey stuff just didn't feel very explanatory or helpful. Oh, okay. Whereas Buddhism felt helpful and still does, really, as in terms of just being able to remember where you are and center yourself before you lash out, rather than reverting to stubbornness or to anger, just, be here now, and remembering that the person on the other side of any interaction is also a human being. Right. And not the enemy, even if they may be your particular enemy. Okay. But the evolutionary worldview provided much more explanatory power than anything I had run into before or since, which is why I stuck.
Okay. It's like a super story, or, and I know that there's, in the development of, evolutionary thinking, there's one kind of debate at some point. I don't remember when, because I've read a lot of the books, but they don't stick. Calling evolution just so stories. There is this thing where it is narrative. There's a narrative power to it.
Because it is our history, right? Because it is our story. And I mean, I think humans, we were talking before about what some of the universals of humans are. This is never on these lists because it doesn't fossilize, and so you can't know. But I would argue that narrative is a human universal throughout, at least since well before writing, probably since campfire. And therefore, those pieces of meaning that we can make of the world that can be told through story are more likely to stick. And that may mean that bad stories, that wrong stories are also more likely to stick. And so, the just so stories objection to evolutionary explanation is based on a real criticism. And the rejoinder to that is, You shouldn't tell any adaptive stories in evolution and expect them to be taken seriously as hypotheses unless they're falsifiable, unless they bring with them predictions that are then theoretically testable, even if you don't yourself test them. Right?
So there's a little bit of metaphorical truth seeking or applied metaphorical truth in the speculation aspect of the evolutionary, I guess, kind of phalange or whatever you're trying to seek. So you tell these stories to see if it works.
Well, I guess to some degree, yes. Any hypothesis that is worth the name hypothesis needs to be testable.
Okay.
Even if only in theory, like even if actually we don't have the means yet, we don't have the resources, whatever it is, we're not going to end up being able to test it. But is there something that it precludes? Like if this hypothesis is true, what else can't be true? How would you falsify this hypothesis? That's what makes it a scientific hypothesis. So if you can't frame whatever story you're telling in the form of a testable, falsifiable hypothesis, then what you're doing is storytelling, and it might be interesting, it might be fun, it might be true, but it's not a scientific hypothesis. It's not science you're engaged in. It's just storytelling, whereas often storytelling can be scientific if it obeys these rules of being falsifiable and testable.
Okay. This might be a leap, but the context in which stories are told. So you laid out different ways to tell whether stories are engaged in truth-seeking or not by being falsifiable or testable. And with regards to myth, maybe they're not, but they, one of in the book, you guys talk about metaphorical truth over time. You can test them over time, or they persist over time. And so you can probably see that there will be certain values that end up being adaptive to the social climate where these stories just keep on getting told, whether that's within the heart, just because people love them naturally, or because maybe nature selected for people who would love these stories, who knows, But within the context of hypothesizing, the communal context of wherein a hypothesis is being told causes certain kind of fallout when you start to talk about a very important issue where people are construing it as a life and death issue. The ability to hypothesize is it becomes limited. And we can talk about big things that are current, but we can also just watch it unfold in the Evergreen story, because there were things that weren't allowed to be questioned because people turned up this fake evolutionary dialogue. They started to lean in onto like a lower level thinking, almost kind of a base level life or death kind of thing.
Yeah, boy. Yeah, there's so much here. For the many people who've never actually been in a science classroom or engaged with scientists who actually do this, try to formulate hypotheses in order to better explain our world, without any attempt to subjugate or to be bigoted or anything, but just in its purest form, what is the scientific method? What are we trying to do? We're trying to generate models that become better and better models of our actual world, right? That come closer and closer to approximating the truth. That's what it is. But and all children are born with a tendency to recognize pattern and to try to figure out if the patterns that they think they recognize are actually a match for the world, without being in any way formal scientists. Most modern education, at least in the weird world, and I think generally formal schooling, does a very poor job of inculcating that scientific curiosity and also formalism in children. And instead it teaches the results of science, and it teaches the strictures of science, which to most people is really boring. It's not interesting. What do you mean
strictures? Like
now we're doing
kills, wash your hands.
Well, and also today we're doing a chemistry lab, and it involves a lot of glassware. And you're going to need to do these things. There's going to be titration, and there's going to be reagents, and they're going to need to be clean up everything at the end. And rule. At the end of it, you may think you know something that you didn't know before, but boy, was that kind of tedious. And boy, do most people not actually want to engage in that sort of thing in their everyday life. And so they begin to think scientists are other people. That's for someone else. I don't actually do science because I don't have that kind of brain. And really, what Brett found at Evergreen, the reason that we loved it for 15 years was most people do have that kind of brain. And all you have to do is walk into a classroom of almost any group of people and say, welcome. We're going to try to figure out what we are and how we would know. Like, let's start with epistemology. Let's start with how it is that we make truth claims. Yeah. And let's make sure that you know that you can question anything that I say. But, over time, as I begin to become more trustworthy to you, like, lay off on the constant, no cynicism, please, just skepticism. And let's try to figure this out. And so, I had trans students who were showing up to try to figure out why they had the dysphoria they did. Yeah. And I had so many students who, if you just describe their demographics and then you say, and we were learning evolution, you would say, well, why were they there? If all you know about Evergreen is the crazy videos from mid 2017, you would say, well, those students never would have shown up in your classroom and learned anything. Well, of course they did, because I was teaching in a way that welcomed everyone, but insisted on rigor and on trying to figure out what was true, and tried to separate out the emotional response from the scientific response without ever pretending that we're not actually humans here who have the emotional response. We have our biases. Yeah. We are going to react in certain ways. And
genocide is probably not a good thing.
Right. And I could say, look, we're going to talk about the products of evolution. It includes genocide, it includes rape. It also includes a mother's love and strangers helping each other on the street. And we can all agree, actually, I'm going to insist that we all agree that the latter two are amazing, and we want to encourage more of that. And the former two are horrifying. And even though evolution handed us all four of those things, the more we understand what it is in us that allows some humans to engage in those first two, we want to minimize that. And to the degree that we can understand what it is in all of us that allows many of us to engage in those last two, more of that, please.
Okay. So it's like this, I'm trying to figure out the primary value would be understanding. And then, of course, some sort of, not moralizing, because, of course, there's moral. You're making a moral statement there, but the chief endeavor is to understand. And then you could probably even, through understanding where rape comes from, or where rape pops up and genocide pops up and mother's love pops up and art pops up, you could probably start to understand why you would probably want to decrease the less and increase the other by looking at the different circumstances. But within a certain moment in history that we both shared, that seeking of understanding was taken over by something else, by another thing that actually threatened the entire project, like the entire roots of the entire project.
And how despicable, really, because you also had many extraordinary experiences at Evergreen.
Yeah.
Right? It was an amazing project with, it had something that no place else had and still no place else has. Right? Yeah. And in part, that's because of the founder. The founders were naive in some ways, and
weird as hell.
Got a few things wrong, and weird as hell as they would have to be. But man, did they get some stuff right? And it's not replicated anywhere else. And how dare a tiny group of people decide to indoctrinate rather than educate and risk the whole project?
Okay, so. But somehow within the system, the indoctrinators won over the educators. There was some sort of circumstance that wasn't able to be talked out of, actually. And Brett did his damnedest to talk out of it. But once those ideas got hold, they just ran through. So I don't know where the question is, but being aware of that, keeping your head, it almost seems like understanding, the project of understanding is doomed to fail if the indoctrinators get their way. In a fascist state or a communist state, science is gone, and the scientists are the weakest ones of the bunch, in a way. So it doesn't seem like science can actually hold up to that. You need like a stronger moral standing, maybe, or How do you?
You need a system that can't be gamed, and that's really easy to say and hard to design, right? Because how would you? How could we have prevented May 2017 at Evergreen and everything since then? I think part of what happened, and this is not an answer to the question, how could we have prevented it? But part of what happened was a reveal of some of the tribal markers that I, at least before that, had not been particularly aware of. As you're well aware of, as presumably your viewers and listeners are well aware of, Evergreen is extremely far left. And, Brett and I fit in really well there. We're also extremely far left without having been unquestioning left. I had not simply voted blue every time. I sometimes voted green, right?
Okay, yeah.
I'd never voted red, but not because those people were evil, as many people on the left would have you believe, but simply because I had thought about the policies and really felt that policies on Team Blue, on Team Democrat, were a better match for what I thought we needed in the world. But many people, and you may have heard this too since Evergreen blew up, you may have been told, and you may actually believe it to be true about yourself, that come on, admit it, you're not actually on the left. Now this has revealed that you're actually a conservative. Brett and I get this, and we say, well, actually, no, still no, because what we believed then, there are some things that are shifting, but what we believed then is still what we believe now, because what we believed was not based on social group. What we believed was based on an assessment of from first principles as much as possible of what it is that we think needs to happen in the world to get us to an actually sustainable and relatively equal place where everyone has opportunity to become their best selves. That was always what it was about for us. It wasn't about tribal membership, but for many people, I think on both sides, on all sides, for many people, what they say they believe is actually about who they're sitting next to, who their friends are, what their friend group is. And so for many on the left, at the point that they were told, there's a racist in your midst, and here are some of the people of color who are saying so, we literally heard, and I'm sure you heard this too, we literally heard from some people, they would say, well, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound like an accurate portrayal. But I know that I want to side with the people of color because that's what my tribe says. So they actually gave themselves...
It's better to be wrong than to be racist, as one of Brett's students said.
Exactly.
When he did the calculus.
Exactly. And so it's entirely about tribal affiliation as the leading light, as opposed to thinking through what might be true.
Okay. That kind of goes back, it kind of reflects back on that process of individuation, which is I think it's a Jungian term, but that spirit quest, that hero's quest. And if you don't go through that, if you miss a chink in that, or if one of the stages in that is charged with a social dictum or a war of some sort, you will... you'll kind of lose access to higher functioning thinking and kind of originating thinking, like that human beings are human beings, right. and you get locked in there. So something sometimes, and maybe it's like Antifa and what happened at Evergreen, and a lot of unrest that we see throughout history is done by people in a certain age range. It might be developmental. That's one way that they do that, but also these historical conditions come down to unify them to act in a certain way, and to not have with regards to whatever Evergreen was fighting for, there was something wrong with the ideology from my perspective. There was these weird ideas that took effect. One thing that you pointed out was there was a tribalism going on, which made people not think anymore, I guess just kind of reflect, parrot or reflect. And there's also the circumstances of how Evergreen was framed by the president as fighting against racism. We're going to solve racism. And then Trump coming in. So there's these extenuating circumstances that charged that.
Yes.
And so if there will be times of disparity and times of crisis, how do we prepare for those, and what are like the preconditions of causing some sort of social fabric to take root in those times of intensity that is actually kind of flexible and not fundamentalist or illiberal or something like that.
Well, I think the fact, just to stay in this particular example with which we are both all too familiar, I think the fact that I was on sabbatical, so I didn't have any active students at the time, but I feel certain that the same would be true for me had I been teaching a program at the time. Not a single one of Brett's students turned on him, right? Which tells you that he, and when I was in the classroom, were doing something that was not about authoritarian, top-down, believe me or you're dead sort of, injunctions.
Okay.
It was about actually empowering people to understand what they were seeing and make decisions on their own. You were one of 17 signatories, I think, of that letter.
17, yeah.
The Evergreen 17, none of whom I think were Brett's students. They were, that was a different group, but none of them caved to the mob. None of them did. And the mob really, really wanted them to. And you were there. The social pressure to just throw Brett under the bus, throw anyone, me then as well, Mike Peros. And then, once you signed that letter, presumably the 17 of you and, Brett's students as well, the social pressure was incredible.
Yeah.
So it's not that it couldn't have been that this man who looked like he was about to be burned at the stake held such authoritarian power over these students that's what was keeping them in line. It would have been so easy for them to turn on him. It would have raised anyone who had wanted to get their status raised at Evergreen at that moment, who had been a Brett student and was now going to be on the side of the mob. They would have had instant fame. The fact that no one did tells you that there was stuff going on in that classroom and also in my classroom. And there were some other faculty as well who were doing the kind of education that was actually empowering people to realize their potential and to stand up to garbage arguments when it came their way, even in the face of social pressure. So I know what that looked like. I did it for 15 years. Brett knows what that looked like. A few other faculty there know what it looked like. I think you do, because I think you were in a few of those programs, although you were never in any of Brett's or mine. We need more of that. And we need enough of it that those things, those little cells as they were, start connecting with one another. And there wasn't enough of it at Evergreen. I think someone actually asked Brett and me in one of our Q&As recently if we thought Evergreen would have ended up differently if I had been actively teaching at the time, like if I hadn't been on sabbatical and if I had students. And I think the question was prompted by this understanding of exactly what I'm describing now, that there were 17 of you who weren't in Brett's class who were brave enough, and probably there were a few more who just hadn't been found by the letter, whatever.
It was all ad hoc. Everything was just pickup. We were all just responding in that moment. Those 3 weeks, everything on Reddit and YouTube and everything was just blowing up. And so some of us were plugged in. But if you do the calculation, only like 3%, 4% of the student body was involved in this stuff. Most people, were not involved and had no reason to actually care because it didn't actually directly affect them, even though outside looking in, the story became the definition of Evergreen in the moment. It was only certain people. It was very chaotic. Yeah,
although I heard from a number of the faculty who I at that point still was in contact with, some of whom I am no longer in contact with, that there were, even in programs that had nothing to do with any of this, moments set aside, whole sessions set aside to talk about it. And always a single note, right? Always demonizing Brett. If only he would sit down and shut up and accept the ideology, then we'd all be able to get back to normal.
Yeah, I was talking about the student body. The other conversation that we are edging into now is the faculty, the freaking faculty and the freaking administration. That's the real question. What about the adults in the room? What about the adults in the room? That was another game. There's another different force of who's talking and who's not talking and who's buying this story and who's not buying the story and why.
So I'm super hopeful given what you just said. And this is actually something I've been arguing when Brett and I have been involved in the last couple of years about trying to reconfigure higher ed and try to figure out a new way forward, a new kind of institution. Sometimes I run into other adults, other would-be faculty and administrators who are like, oh, well, how will we find students? Like, oh my God. There are so many students so hungry for an actual college education, an actual college level education where we actually empower them to think and to understand what to make of the world. I'm concerned personally about where to find the faculty. And that's not to say that there aren't some terrific faculty out there, but if we're going to limit ourselves to the ones who have gotten the terminal degrees and who think that they want jobs in higher ed, too many are cowards. And so I'm hopeful that given what you just said, Benjamin, that even though those conversations were happening in a lot of classrooms after Evergreen was blowing up, and there was a lot of silence in those classrooms, that actually that silence from the students did not mean, yes, I agree, but meant, oh my God, the faculty person in the front of the room has the power to write my evaluation, and I'm just going to sit here and be quiet, not because I agree, but because I don't even know what world I'm in anymore.
Yeah. What's the risk? I was speaking to a brilliant young woman yesterday. She's in LA. She does a YouTube channel I just found, and she did a video about me, and that's why I found her. But she was talking about her growth, and I think she graduated college in 2009, but she went to university and she started studying journalism, and her journalist professor said, if you want, you shouldn't go into journalism because you're after the truth, and that's not what journalism is about anymore.
Ouch.
Actually dissuade her. And then she goes to Hollywood to be creative, and she gets into the industry. It's like, oh, this isn't about creativity at all. This isn't about art anymore. But we can see that there is a huge demand for truth from the public. There's a huge demand for art and entertainment, and there's a huge demand for education. There's a huge demand. There's parents screaming out for good places to send their children. And somehow there's these institutional rot or whatever. I don't know. Do you guys diagnose it? Like, what is it that is not meeting this demand, but foisting these subpar products upon our plates?
This baffles me. And it baffles Brett too. I think he would say that if he was sitting here with me. Why in this environment, no institution that exists already, and there are some that are trying to come into existence, but no institution that exists already is saying, actually, no. Even just such a simple thing as the Chicago principles, with regard to some, the anti oppression of speech stuff that Chicago Principles is from, like, gosh, I want to say like 2014, 15. Okay. Yeah.
16. And it was interesting. George Bridges wrote a letter against them and published it in the Seattle Times.
Of course he did. Of course he did. Right. But, it felt like for a few years after Evergreen blew up, like, okay, University of Chicago is this beacon on a hill, this shining light on the hill. No. Well, even there, no, not following their own principles. So why not? Like, who is scaring them sufficiently that even though the demand from so many students and so many parents is, by God, give us something where we can actually go and learn how to be our best selves and how to be maximally productive in a world that is changing so fast we can't keep up, and there's nothing on offer? Like, why wouldn't 1 or 10 or 100 of these institutions say, you know what, that's going to be me? I don't know the answer to that. It doesn't make sense to me.
But a new world is possible.
It has to be. It has to be, else why continue on? I do think it is, but I also, even more than that, will say I have to believe it's possible, or else I don't know how to wake up in the morning and find the meaning that I have.
Okay. There's like an intermediary step between the whatever's on offer now, which has ascendancy through all major institutions, and then this weird, and then the future institutions, and then where we are now. Specifically me, we're thrust into the world like some sort of Hegelian parable, like into this weird YouTube land where we're like, you're professor, but are you a professor now? I don't know. I'm a storyteller. Am I a storyteller now? What's going on? Like,
right.
There's a temptation to become an institution yourself, is there not? I mean, just by the way that this stuff works, you have to think about branding, you have to think about your audience, you have to think about the bottom line, you have to be the administrator and the professor too. How the hell are you adapting to that? What are some of the greatest lessons that you've had to learn on the fly, if you're willing to speak to that?
Oh my God. I do not want to be my own administrator. I definitely don't want to be my own accountant or bookkeeper or marketer or publicist or business manager. And all of those things. I don't want it. Or, HR, sourcing my own health insurance.
Okay. Like, I thought you were talking about disciplining your
disciplining
your key
my dog.
grip.
It is. I questioned almost everything about higher ed, even a couple years before Evergreen blew up, like just because that is both how I and how Brett roll. And that's part of how we engage with the world. Even systems that we're really thrilled with, we go, okay, what about this is definitely what it claims to be and what isn't. And so I was thrilled. I loved having tenure, even though it was not called tenure at Evergreen, but I thought conversion. Yes, I had been converted, and I thought the job security that I thought that gave me really did give me a freedom to do what I wanted to do in the classroom and in the field and in the lab with students that I couldn't have done anywhere else.
Okay.
In part, in particular, because of how Evergreen was framed, but being freed, because being part of an institution meant that I didn't have to worry about my health insurance, right? Or whether or not I'd have a room in which to run my programs. And yes, half the time that I showed up in that room, the tech wasn't working, but there was a phone on the wall that I could pick up and call tech support and have them fix whatever was broken about the tech that day.
Okay.
And having full autonomy is, of course, better in almost every way, because that security that I thought I had didn't turn out to be security, obviously. Right? Yeah. Tenure didn't turn out to mean what they say it means. But the perilousness of every day going, well, we're effectively crowdfunded. And it's amazing, because being recognized when you go out into the world and having the feedback come in through the various channels is, almost all of it is incredibly gratifying. And it really suggests that there is something, not all of, but something of what I was doing and Brett was doing in the classroom that we're able to convey into the world now. But it's wonderful that that's at the whim of the people whom we are reaching, but there's also no pretense of security in the way that there was a pretense of security before. And I have to keep saying the comparison looks like it's more perilous, but of course what I thought was security wasn't. So this is simply better, but it's also very, very hard to have to learn on the fly. And I know I'm sure you will have had this experience as well. Learn on the fly all the business side of things that I never wanted to have to do, and I still don't want to do, and I'm not very good at. I wish to be freed of it.
So I guess that kind of goes to some level of considering a social safety net of some sort, like an occupational safety net. And, people talk about the balance between security and liberty, and Evergreen was trying to make a very secure and very liberated environment, like autonomy, like the palette that you were given to paint was immeasurable, and, it came with certain costs. You're not, it's not an elite institution. You're not demanded to do research papers or get published at a certain frequency. But the liberty was also weighed down by responsibility. You had to, participate in the organization, and there was all these different trade-offs. This isn't sustainable. The YouTube thing is not sustainable. I'm not talking about just your career, just my career, but just like this is an in-between state. Yes. And we can't trust YouTube. We can't trust, talk about institutional security. I don't give a crap, so there's got to be something on the horizon. Where do we look? Where do we look? Where do we go? What are some of the ideas that, going back to where we began with the speculative mind? Yeah. Like, what are some possible horizons? for, giving, and I guess with regards to both of our content to a greater or lesser degree, giving people good information, giving people good skills, bringing people whatever we're bringing them, which within your previous life as a professor was through the classroom. And I think you guys have replicated that almost on this virtual platform, minus security, but also probably there's other feedback mechanisms that I'm sure you miss from the classroom.
Minus the actual relationships.
Yeah.
Right? The big thing that's missing that Evergreen afforded was actually knowing every single one of your students and being able, therefore, to tailor every set of interactions that you had to, with each passing day or week that you had for a program, and, more so the longer it was. For a year-long program, week one, you may not know anyone in the room. But by the end of that week, I always made a point of I knew everyone's name and at least something else about them that was true about them, that was not totally trivial, not their height or something. But and so as with every passing week, you get a little bit more sense of who they are and how they think, and that was part of what was such a joy about Evergreen. And that's I think being able to do that, and for me, and for Brett, the requirement that we do that, like we couldn't have imagined teaching without that. Not all the faculty dealt that way, but that was part and parcel of Evergreen's founding principles being about education and not about research. And so, we exhibited our research in the classrooms. And, this book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, is really the result of the thinking that we did in real time with the students. And we weren't publishing papers because that really is a totally different thing, a totally different way to go about being a professor, being an academic, and it's the standard way. And so, we don't have the usual metrics that people who had contributed as much as I'm going to claim we've contributed might have.
You have
but
relationships.
We had relationships, and with those real people, undergraduates that they were, we were developing ideas in real time. And so how do you replicate those relationships in this, brave new world? You can't. So at some level, it can't scale. Like, that level of interaction can't scale to reaching thousands of people at a time. So you need both, both being able to reach thousands of people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people at a time is amazing and feels much more empowering in one way than reaching 25 people at a time. But it also, each of those people is getting something that you then can't track and go, oh, wait, no, that's not what I meant. Like there's a little misunderstanding here. And we see this even in the book, right? Like we tried to write the static document that really needs to be a living document. And if someone misses the rejection of the naturalistic fallacy early and then decides that we're making prescriptions for how all humans must be, like, no, that's not what we're trying to do here. That's a misunderstanding of evolutionary theory that is all too common in, for instance, social science and many of the humanities, but is very much not what we're doing. So that tension between the reaching more people and reaching fewer people in a way that you can actually help frame and guide the journey that they have as their thinking evolves is real. And none of that addresses the how do we create media? Like, how do we reach those hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in a way where we're not just all lone wolves, as we kind of are now, in our different YouTube channels, et cetera. Yeah. But with the oversight of some, wolf master like YouTube that at any moment, could just decide, actually not you. That's misinformation. Yeah. I don't like you. That's the thing that absolutely has to end. And I don't know. Yeah. I don't know what the answer is because they've got the eyes. As much, we stream on Odyssey. Yeah. Well, I meant what they're watching for sure, but I meant that they've got, people go to YouTube when they want to find content.
Oh, okay,
yeah. So the other direction of the eyes, we stream on Odyssey too, and we're glad to do so, but we can't just go to Odyssey because no one's heard of Odyssey. No one, right? And in order for people to have heard of Odyssey, people need to have heard of Odyssey. So, it's this catch-22 that is hard to escape yet.
This is the first time we've spoken, except for once we spoke on your porch with Brett, and I'm talking about on my channel.
Publicly, yes.
On my channel.
We've had coffee together and such.
Yeah. Maybe a meal or twice.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's so many things I wish I could have time to speak about. There's so many things in this conversation we can go back to. We hit some deep pockets.
Let's do it then. Let's come back to this.
Let's do it again. I guess kind of like a final question or just a proposition. There's an idea. I don't know why I'm bringing this up, but there's this idea of a code of ethics for podcasting, and it's kind of taken from a code of ethics of journalism. At some mythical point in journalism, they came up with a code of truth and ethics in journalism. We're gonna be truthful in journalism. We're gonna try to check our sources, and they came up with a list of different values that could sustain or that could build up reputation, could build up not just relevance, but reputation and kind of authority, like the penumbra of authority, but was based on providing good content that was solid, like a Walter Cronkite era. Or, William F. Buckley, love him or hate him, he was really good at what he did and like having a good argument. And so there's got to be good principles that we could be adopting or returning to that aren't necessarily like if you fail them, then you're out of the game or something like that. I just wonder on the fly as you're doing this, what has held up from being a professor and from other things of like trying to provide trying to turn your momentary relevance into like a solid body of work that you're, the people respect. Like, what are the values that inform good content that I could be emulating that you try to emulate?
Well, I mean, I think you're doing amazing work. I hope you know that I think that. And I think one of the things that is absolutely paramount was in the classroom, is for Brett and me on our podcast. A book is different because it's static, and so you can't reify it quite the same way, but is continuing to fact check yourself after you've made a pronouncement and coming back and correcting your errors. And obviously there's small stuff that maybe you don't have to, and if you just change your mind about something that wasn't based on fact, it was just your opinion, maybe you don't need to, although I don't have anything in my mind when I'm saying that.
Okay.
But just if you are in the business of saying things to people based on what you are seeing in the world, and you get new evidence that is contravening, or you take another look at the old evidence and say, actually I missed something, or I don't even know why, but I'm now seeing this in a new light, you owe it to your audience to tell them that.
Okay.
And you do not owe it to your audience to keep talking about the same stuff all the time. You don't owe it to your audience to keep talking in the same way that you've done before. And in fact, you don't want to, because audience capture is real.
A little bit of novelty. Yeah. A little bit of novelty.
And just follow your interests. But you do owe it to them. If you actually have if you've seen something new that changes something you've said, you need to tell them. Yeah. And I haven't seen you do that, but I certainly totally assume you would. I would be shocked if you would obscure that from your audience.
I got really frustrated a couple weeks ago about certain things that our government is forcing on people, and I lashed out and I said some things, and then I looked at them the next morning. I'm like, I shouldn't have. I issued a correction and I retracted my statement, because I just try not to be mean. I'm, like you said, I'm kind of a romantic kind of poet, so I don't. I feel things more than I know things. That's how I, respond to things, and that's kind of basically my my product. The thing is that just to add to what you're saying, so if you go forth, you say something, your critics, and you guys have more critics than I do, but you have some very dedicated critics.
So dedicated.
Something right.
They're doing something very, very wrong.
Or they're doing
so dedicated to hating on us.
They're really into you. But you can correct yourself, but they won't correct their model of you.
Right.
So I guess with regards to critics that aren't willing to update their model of you presented with new information, they should be discounted. I mean, is that just like that you just played yourself there, or whatever, I guess. It's difficult.
No, it is difficult because we all need to listen to the critics that come at us. Like,
yes,
we will all be wrong sometimes, and some things about which we may not be wrong, but there may be more to what we're saying. Though, that can look like criticism as well. So we need to have our ears open to those voices that don't just sound adulating. Of course we do, but
or irritating.
Or exactly. There will be things that come, and sometimes the tone will be wrong and it will be hard to listen, but we owe it to ourselves, and given that we have audiences, we owe it to our audience to hear what people have to say. And that doesn't mean we get too much at this point to read absolutely everything that comes in, but we try to read, and we have someone who edits and makes sure to send us negative stuff as well as positive.
Oh, okay.
And that's explicit in our agreement with this person. That said, at the point that you come to know individuals who will not update their model or make corrections themselves when something they've said has been demonstrably wrong, you don't have to continue to pay attention to them. And in fact, it's probably antithetical to being your best self and most creative and most productive and most likely to discover new things in the world if you do keep going over and looking at what they have to say. It's just the same stuff over and over again. If they've demonstrated that they're not holding themselves to the same standards that you are, you don't need to keep engaging.
Yeah. So, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century is on bookshelves, if people believe in bookshelves anymore, but it is definitely downloadable, uploadable. Who did the audiobook? I didn't get the audiobook. Did you guys do that yourself?
Yeah, we did. Mm-hmm.
What was that like? Was that fun?
It was actually fun. Yeah, I was not looking forward to it, but it was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Oh, cool. And it's doing really well, right? We don't need to,
We made the New York Times bestseller list.
There you go.
Yeah. We're on it.
It's pretty good for a first book.
It's pretty great. It's technically my second book, but
okay. Published? Not yet. This is the first published book?
No.
You have another published book.
I published a book in 2002. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Indeed. It's called Antipode. It's probably out of print by now, although I have the rights, so it may be going back into print at some point. Oh. It's about my experiences, my research and life in Madagascar. It's a very different sort of book.
Oh, wow. Well,
6 Lives of Poison Frogs. That's that whole thing.
Oh, yeah, okay. So it was like an extension of your dissertation kind of thing, like a building up on top of that?
No, it's for a lay audience. Cool. It was St. Martin's Press, and they called it literary nonfiction. But I was in Madagascar to do the dissertation research, yes.
Well, when you're charting your meaning-making or meaning-seeking story, you began with word crafting, wordsmithing, you said, and you definitely are. That's like core of your. That's the first thing I heard from you. Is you sending me this beautiful letter, thanking me for the signing the Evergreen 17 letter. I'm like, wow, who is this scientist? They can write.
That's right. That was so. The first I heard from you, I don't know who among you wrote that letter. The Evergreen 17.
It was shopped. It was like this Google Doc. I didn't even. Yeah. I submitted some edits that didn't take. So there's some glaring.
By shopped, you mean like workshopped? Is that or just
workshopped? Yeah.
So never. The best work never emerges from that process, but it was a very compelling letter. But I guess it felt like the first time I'd been communicated to by you, and then you responded to my letter to you that I wrote to you.
And then came the videos.
How many are we at now? How many Evergreen videos?
With the Evergreen? Oh, Jesus. Well, there's the documentary. It was 24 and 2 epilogues. I need to do the second epilogue. The Where Are They Now for the students, which I just don't want to actually look up where they are. And they actually kind of mostly disappeared, but I can do you guys and Naima, and a couple of other people. And then there's the expose Evergreen. I think I have a couple more, and I'm kind of done. I think I did my due diligence.
I think you did.
It's like 150 or something. I think
God.
anything more would be obsession. I think I'm gonna draw a line in the sand there.
Oh man, you did the world such a service, and you certainly did us such a service. But you really, Mike Nana also with his 3-part series, extraordinary. Yeah. But between the two of you, very different, right? Like in his hour and a half feels like a lot of footage for people. But like you just took it across the finish line.
Well, I did the Evergreen treatment of Evergreen, right?
You did. You really did.
They actually, Eric Smith has taught me, showed it in his class, so I'm on the syllabus in some places now, that documentary, which is kind of interesting. Right?
I'm really pleased to hear that.
Yeah. So you guys do a podcast at least once a week, or is it twice a week?
It's once a week at this point. We started out twice a week, but that quickly grew a little much.
Yeah. So what else is going, can people look forward from you, from your pen and from your mug?
Yeah, well, I do have a Substack now, Natural Selections. So once a week I post things, and it's mostly just whatever thing in evolution or nature or humanity I feel like writing about. So let's see, today's Tuesday. So I posted one today, and this week is about maple trees and tree frogs and phenotypic plasticity. So it's really not political at all. There've been a few things that verge into political, and actually I've got one that I'm going to post sometime in the next couple of weeks on medicating trans kids. So, I'm going to just jump right into that water.
Okay. So it's just beware. It's hot in that pool.
Yeah, I know.
From what I hear.
Abigail Schreier and I did a letter wiki together that was amazing. I loved, and I love her. She's fabulous. Yeah. So I know that landscape, and it's one of the hills that I am completely willing to die on, because at some level this one's easy, and it's not easy politically, but this one is easy biologically.
Yeah, and there's a lot of clarifying that needs to happen. Colin Wright does excellent work. Abby does excellent work. Helen Joyce has done excellent work. I've been fortunate to have so many people on my program. So having you and your skill set is going to be really helpful in that. And so maybe we can leave on a cliffhanger, because I did want to talk to you about an evolutionary feminism, or feminism through an evolutionary lens, which I think is a different story that is ripe for telling, and then that folds into what do people do with our sexed bodies. So maybe we can set up something on that.
Sounds good.
In the future. All right. Well, thank you very much, Heather, for joining me finally.
Thank you, Benjamin. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to coming back.
Congratulations for reaching the end of the discussion. If you enjoyed it, do be sure to leave a review or a comment or a thumbs up or whatever you need to do to show that glorious algorithm that this is some good stuff. And do be sure to go and check that back catalog, as it is brimming full of fantastic conversations. Links to provide monetary support are down there in the description as well. Have a good night.